Hello, my friends, hello, and welcome once again to Stately Von Manor, where Roger and I have returned. Because it's Wednesday, that means it's Epic Comic Book Wednesday. Every Wednesday, we'll talk about a certain comic book, graphic novel, or comic book subject. Steve Donoghue over on his channel will talk about the same comic book, graphic novel, or comic book subject. It is our world's finest team up that we do once a week. And this week, we've got a comic book subject today. Roger and I are going to fix modern comics. We're going to tell you how to fix modern comics. Nobody's going to listen to us, but we're going to tell you anyway. So, comic books in the modern world do not sell nearly as well as they used to back in the olden days when Roger and I used to read comics. Roger used to read comics in papyrus, but that was a long time ago. But they used to put comics on the walls back in your old houses. Anyway, comic books today, they just don't sell as well as they used to, and they've had some other issues in their issues. So we'll talk about that. Basically, the idea for today is, this is the idea I gave to Steve to run with. If Marvel or DC were crazy enough to hand over their comic book lines to me or Steve, what would we do? What would we do to make sure that this line of comics would actually sell? And, be a decent line of comics. Now, I'm talking today, when I say what we do to fix comics, I'm talking about one of those two big companies, either DC or Marvel. I'm not talking about independent comics, which I think are probably doing all right creatively. I'm talking about superhero comics, DC and Marvel comics, which have had problems. The indie comics, I think, have been doing all right creatively. I think their big problem is that they don't sell well enough and you can't find them, which brings us to the first main problem, which I don't know if it can be fixed in comic books, which is distribution, and the fact that comic books are a lot harder to find than they used to be. Back when I was younger, in the 70s and 80s and 90s, comics were a lot easier to find. You could buy comics in all kinds of different places. They used to have these places called newsstands where you can go and buy your comics. You can go to the 7-Eleven and buy comics. You can go to all kinds of places and buy comics. Nowadays, unless you live near a comic book store, you can't find comics. And a lot of places, most places, don't have a comic book store. I mean, in most places that you live nowadays, it can be hard to find comics. That is the main problem probably in selling comics, is that you just can't find them. And that doesn't help selling your comic books, especially in a world where you have so many other entertainment options, which, comics always had other things to compete with, like television and the movies, but not like today, where you basically, you can carry your phone around with you and it's in a whole tiny entertainment system. So comics have that to contend with. And they also have to contend with the fact that, they're very expensive. I mean, comics used to be affordable. I mean, even with inflation and everything, comics are just super expensive. If you want to buy like a company's whole line of comic books every week, you're putting down some cash. That's an investment that you're putting down just to read comic books. So that's another problem with comics. And I'm not sure those two things can be fixed. One thing that you can do though is with the comic books themselves and the stories themselves. That I think you can do something with. And if I were put in charge of Marvel or DC, there are certain things that I think I would do that I think would help. And it all comes down to the quality of the stories and the artwork, and making sure that you respect the integrity of the characters that you're writing and drawing in your comic books. And I think that has been probably the main problem over the years. You've had a few problems. One has been that comic book companies have, for the longest time, gone in for gimmicks and things that would help their sales in the short term. For a while, for example, Marvel Comics was killing off a major character every month. Marvel Comics has literally killed off everybody. It's like a slaughter over there at Marvel Comics. They killed off Spider-Man, they killed off Wolverine, they killed off Captain America. Who didn't they kill? They killed a lot of characters over there. And DC, they did a lot of that same kind of thing. And it's always temporary. They always have to bring characters back. They also have done that thing that's super annoying where they will replace your characters with other characters. And part of this is in pursuit of that ever elusive new audience. DC has done a lot of that, and Marvel has done that too, where they'll take a character and they will change that character to another character. It's just so annoying. Batman is Bruce Wayne. Batman is Bruce Wayne. Superman is Clark Kent. And when you buy, when you as a comic book fan go to the comic book store to buy a comic book about your favorite character, you should get your favorite character. You shouldn't get some weird replacement. And I would put some rules down once I took control of the comic book company, whether it was Marvel or DC. Let's just say I'm taking over DC, for example. Superman is going to remain Clark Kent. Batman is going to be Bruce Wayne. There are a few Green Lanterns. But, for the most part, you're going to get these characters, and they're going to be those characters. They're not going to be some weird versions of those characters. And another thing that's been plaguing comic books forever, which I wouldn't get away from entirely, really, is the big, gigantic events. I wouldn't have them as often. Every year, I think or probably every 6 months nowadays, comic books will do some gigantic big event, which will invade all of the titles. And so, no matter what other storyline is going on in another title, it has to follow along with this event. I would change that a little bit. I wouldn't get rid of them entirely because sometimes events can be fun, but I certainly wouldn't do them as often as they've been done in the past. My partner over on his channel, Steve Donoghue, will doubtless mention identity politics and politics in general in comic books. He will have a lot to say about this. I will say that comic books should be for everyone. Everybody should be able to read comic books without being lectured, You should be able to read a superhero comic book and just get a superhero adventure. And they should be written by writers who respect and hopefully love the characters. When that happens, you're going to get a good comic book. I would be careful about who I would hire to write the comics. They should not have any other agenda other than writing a good comic book about whatever character they're writing. You should be able to get a good Batman adventure when you pick up a Batman comic. One of the problems that DC has had, for example, aside from all of that, is their constant reboots. And I think this is partly because, in trying to get a new audience, which comic books always seem to struggle with, they will do these, every once in a while, do these massive reboots to their continuity, which has made DC comic books continuity incomprehensible. Continuity is important, and it just shouldn't be destroyed like they did in Crisis on Infinite Earths and later on in the New 52, because when you wipe out continuity, you're usually going to wipe out characters and things about the characters that somebody out there loves, But there is the problem that you've got, 50 or 60 years of a character who couldn't possibly exist that long. And so you do have that problem. Marvel has a not perfect solution in continuity, in that it's, no matter when you're reading the comic book, the Marvel Universe started 15 years ago about. And the continuity ever shifts, This only becomes a real problem when you read old comic books and you see real life events or real life people in them. Nothing dates a comic book like Ronald Reagan being in the comic book or Richard Nixon being in the comic book. Or I remember those 9/11 comics that they had, which can't possibly exist now in continuity because all the characters would be too old. Continuity is important, but you don't have to pay that much attention to it. It used to be that you didn't like it. I remember in the 80s, we got to the point in the 1980s where in Marvel Comics, for example, for a long time in Marvel Comics, the characters actually did age. Peter Parker got older. Eventually, this became a problem. By the 1970s, this started becoming a problem. And I've been reading the Fantastic Four, and in the Fantastic Four, for example, Marv Wolfman actually came up with a way to make the Fantastic Four younger, because at this point, Reed Richards and Ben Grimm would be in their 60s, and who knows how old Sue Storm would be. So he came up with a way to make them younger. But eventually, a few years after that, they just started to not worry about it. These comic book characters started to become more like the DC comic characters, who just never aged. They always existed in the present time, and they were always around the same age. And that's kind of the way it's got to be. It's got to be kind of like James Bond, where James Bond is always a certain age, no matter what era he's in. So you can think these past stories did happen, but when they happened is an ever-shifting thing. And probably if I were to take over DC, for example, I know this is very rambly, Roger, but it's early. It's 4:11 in the morning, so, I ramble. If I were taking over DC, I might actually start it with an event, but it would be a different event. Instead of instead of it ending up destroying all continuity, somehow it would be like, okay, all that stuff happened, but now we live in this one world. There would still be alternate Earths. You know, you don't want to get rid of the alternate Earths. But, you know, we all live in this one world. All that stuff somehow happened, but we're going to concentrate on the here and now. One thing I would do is I wouldn't restart everything with #1 issues, because there have been so many #1 issues. Comic books have been restarted so many times that #1 issues are now meaningless. They used to be a big deal as a collector's item. Now they're meaningless. So I would actually, like for Superman, for example, the main Superman title, I would take all the Superman issues that have existed under the title of Superman, all of the series, and just add them up. And, you know, much like Action Comics, which they did this with and is now at 1,000 something, I would do that with all the runs. So they would all have a pretty high number as far as what issue they were. And I would just go from there. I would just concentrate on the stories and the characters. I would not give writers free rein to do whatever the hell they wanted to do. I would have rules in place. You can't, for example, have Superman just announce his secret identity to the world as he did, because of course you're going to have to retcon that, because he has a superhero identity, a secret identity. He has a secret identity for a reason, right? There are certain things about characters that should stay the same. And you just have to respect that as a writer. You're just going to have to come up with good stories about these characters, you know, using your imagination without having to do some gimmick. And if you come up with rock solid stories and you hire really good artwork, people are going to want to buy the comic. It's not that difficult, really, if you think about it. This has been done in the past and it's worked. It's happening now with Conan, for example. The new Conan comic book, you go buy the new Conan comic book and you're getting Conan, right? You're getting the character that you expect when you buy a Conan comic book. And it's good. It's a good comic book about the character that you want to read about. You should be able to get a Batman comic book, and it should be about Batman, and it should be a good Batman story with really good artwork, and that should be enough to sell it. This has happened before. Like, I remember back in the 90s. Remember in the 90s at Marvel Comics when suddenly Marvel forgot how to do most of their superheroes? They just couldn't figure out how to sell the Avengers. And the Avengers sucked, and Thor started to suck. And Thor sucked for a while, and Iron Man was a disaster. They didn't know what to do with these characters. But over on Captain America, they hired Mark Waid, who loved Captain America. And you had great art on the comic book as well. And suddenly, Captain America was doing really well. It was a really good comic book. And then they fired him because they hired all the Image guys to come back and do their comics, and they sucked. But they did learn from this experience, because after Heroes Reborn was over, they rehired Mark Waid to do Captain America. And they got some good creators to work on the Avengers and Thor, and Avengers and Thor were suddenly good, and Fantastic Four was good. And so they did learn. And even now, they hired Mark Waid to do World's Finest, and it's an excellent comic book. Mark Waid, no matter what you think of him personally, he does write good comic books. And that's who you need. You need good writers to write good stories, and it shouldn't matter what their politics are. You know, we should probably stop worrying about that so much and just concentrate on the characters and the stories. like I said, because of comic book distribution, comic books will never sell as well as they used to. They're too expensive. I'm not sure you could fix that. You can't find them most places. I'm not sure you can fix the comic book distribution at this point. The people who own Marvel and own DC have enough money to fix it if they wanted to, but they're not going to put the money into it to do it. So, the days of comic books selling like they used to are over. And unfortunately, that means in a lot of places, if you live in a place without a comic book shop, comic books are over. You have no place to buy your comics. But if you do live in a place where they sell comic books, you should be able to go there, and if you're spending that much money, you should get a really, really well-written, well-drawn comic book that's not going to lecture you about politics, that's just going to give you an excellent story about these characters that we love. And it should be about the characters we love, not some weird replacement characters. They should be our characters. I think if you do that, you'll sell comic books. Damn, I've rambled on a long time. I gotta go have some coffee now. Okay, guys, we'll catch you next time.